Thanks. All right. This is wonderful. I understand you have 183 countries here. How do you do it, David? It's almost another United Nations, except that you have stronger voices, you are younger, you are more dynamic, and you probably have something to teach us, the old generation, when it comes to working together. Good. I'm really very happy to join you, and I want to thank David and the organizers for starting this organization. I recall it wasn't so long ago that you started it, and suddenly here we are with a dynamic group of future leaders discussing the issues of the world. I'm here also today to talk to you about intervention, a book I have just written, and I wanted to explain why I wrote intervention. And intervention deals with the world, with people like you, myself, and others. It talks of hope that brings people together to form grassroots organizations and sometimes intercede, intervene, and try to do something for their fellow men and women. It deals with people linking up to form a global community of activism to be able to create tangible change and make real difference in people's lives. I have been fortunate enough to serve as Secretary General of the United Nations and also as a former head of UN peacekeeping operations. So I lived through lots of experiences which I share with you in the book. Talk about how we tackle some of these issues behind the scenes and how we try to make the world a better place. I hope once you've read the book, some of you will decide to become engaged in public life. And if few of you join your government, the UN, other institutions, it doesn't matter these days. Wherever we are, we can make a difference. From the private sector to NGOs, to non-government, foundations, we all can make a difference. And I know often one asks, when I travel around, young people come to me and ask, how can I be a good global citizen? My answer always is, it starts in your community. It starts at home. It starts in your universities and in your schools. And I think later on in the afternoon, we'll exchange some words about how one reacts to some of the big issues confronting us. But you have to remember that you should not always aim to go and tackle the big issues confronting us. If each of us did our bit collectively, we make a difference. And nobody starts right from the beginning tackling the big issues. I probably started organizing a hunger strike at the age of 16. I tried to make a difference. David, I'm sure, did not start where he is today. We all start at some level, and we move on. And so whatever we do, or whatever we did yesterday is part of us today. What we do today will be part of us tomorrow, and we grow and we move on. For me, what I'm talking about to you today started in the Gold Coast when I was a teenager and the struggle for independence was beginning. It was an exciting period for us. We were all in boarding schools, very excited about this big thing, independence and freedom. And we achieved it. Suddenly, as a young man coming out of high school, seeing that Gold Coast has become Ghana, the first African independent country, and had inspired other countries to seek their independence. And for a young person who could feel the electricity in the air, for a young person who had all this talk about change, and suddenly change arrives. the Prime Minister becomes a Ghanaian, the police commissioner, the head of the army, all are Ghanaians. And so in a relatively short period of 4, 5, 6 years, you see dramatic change taking place. And so I grew up with a sense that change is possible. Even the most basic, fundamental, radical change is possible. And I've lived my life believing that change is possible. Testing, don't accept when people say, this is the way we do it. Ask, why do you do it this way? Ask the question, what should we be doing? Don't let them sell you, this is what we do. And constantly challenge and test. And of course, when I became Secretary General, I was quite anxious to see some progress in Africa. And so I recall my first appearance before the Organization of African States with all the African heads of states in the room. Some were military men who had taken over power by force. Some were dictators who had been in power for a long time. And I remember as our first encounter, I spoke to the delegates assembled with civil society leaders in the galleries, telling them you should not accept any leader who comes to power through a coup d'etat, who takes over power through the barrel of a gun. You could hear a pin drop in that room. There was a bit of applause, but it wasn't from the floor where the leaders were. It came from the civil society and the NGOs. But 2 years later, they passed a law that they will not accept any leader who comes to power through a coup d'etat. And that is the situation today. And so in the rare situations where coup d'etats have taken place, those who have done it come in and say, we are not staying. We will have an election within a year or 18 months and withdraw to the barracks, and that is where they belong. So we've done a lot trying to improve governance and democracy in Africa, encouraging, and as some of you know, I got involved in Kenya in 2008 after the violence that ensued following the elections. And we were able to get them to agree to form a coalition government and calm the situation. We are also encouraging African governments to focus on agriculture and increase food production and at least be able to feed the countries. Africa had become a place where we produce what we don't eat and export and import all that we eat, but that is also changing, and you will see that. The book Intervention also deals with the end of the Cold War, where the United Nations, which had been divided throughout the Cold War period, suddenly could take decisions that it couldn't take. Suddenly the Security Council could come together and authorize peacekeeping operations. Peacekeeping operations that before then you could not get agreements on. But there was also another change. The post-Cold War peacekeeping operations also got involved in civil wars. Until then, all the peacekeeping operations were between nations, where two nations have gone to war, accepted a peace agreement, and the peacekeepers go in to monitor the implementation of the peace agreement. But with the new change, which opened up involvement in civil war situations, it changed the game dramatically. But the organization did not follow through with the requirements and the resources that would be required. Because when you get involved in a civil war situation, you have to understand that you may have to fight. You will be attacked, and the soldiers may have to defend themselves, the peacekeepers, that is. And we should also understand that peacekeeping is not a risk-free operation, and there will be casualties. And explain to the population before the soldiers are deployed. Because we don't do that, when a group of soldiers are killed, the tendency for the government is to withdraw all the peacekeepers. We saw this in Somalia, and I'm sure some of you have seen the film Black Hawk Down, where a US helicopter was shot down and the troops dragged through the streets. Following that, thousands of US troops left Somalia, and almost all the Western countries followed, and the operations collapsed. This was about the time Rwanda was bubbling up, and then we had the difficulties in Rwanda without adequate resources, and we could not give them the help they needed, and we let them down. I'm not implying we could have solved the entire situation. The genocide that ensued killed 800,000 people. We had, at the end, about 250 soldiers there who couldn't really do much. And having lived through Somalia, Rwanda, and Bosnia, and Srebrenica, an area the UN had declared a safe haven, where 8,000 Muslim men were marched and out of the safe area and killed. I kept wondering, what can we do as an international community to try to prevent a future Rwanda, a future Srebrenica? And that was the beginning of the new norm, responsibility to protect, R2P. Because I challenged the General Assembly in 1999 to think through what we will do if tomorrow there's another Rwanda or there's a Srebrenica. How are we going to respond as an international community? Are we going to sit on our hands? And if there is a coalition of the willing ready to go in, do we stand them down because they don't have the mandate of the Security Council? So we pose these questions. And then Canada, the Canadian government, took up the challenge and set up a commission chaired by Gareth Evans of Australia and Mohamed Sanoun of Algeria. And they came up with a report entitled Responsibility to Protect, which I thought was a better title than what I was pushing, which was humanitarian intervention. And the word intervention spooked lots of countries. And I think Algeria, President Bouteflika spoke very eloquently for those who were not comfortable with the concept, saying this norm will offer an opportunity, an open license to bigger countries to intervene in smaller ones, which was obviously not the intention. So the Canadians came up with their report, which was distributed liberally, and at the summit in 2005, the member states embraced the concept of responsibility to protect. And basically, that concept tells leaders you can no longer hide behind national sovereignty as a shield behind which you brutalize your own people. And for those of us outside that country, we couldn't use the excuse of an internal issue not to do something. And of course, intervention does not mean always use of force. In Kenya, we never use force. It starts with political pressure, diplomatic, economic, and force is a last resort. And of course, when I talk of intervention of the UN, whether we are intervening in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, whether we are engaged in pushing economic development through the Millennium Development Goals, whether we are trying to make peace between Lebanon and Israel following the Hezbollah conflict, whether we are trying to intervene on behalf of those living with HIV/AIDS. These are all forms of intervention which concerns all of us. And of course, in trying to do this work, I often had the challenge of dealing with some very wicked dictators. And people ask me, how come you talk to these guys? If you want to save lives, if you want to make peace, you have to talk to those who can make a difference. You have to talk to them to begin to influence them. You make peace not with your friends, with your enemies, and it is men like that who often are standing in the way of peace that you have to deal with. And so you shake hands with the devil to save lives and to make peace. And these are men that normally you wouldn't have a drink with, but you have to deal with them. I would want to leave quite a bit of time for discussions with David, and for questions from the floor. So let me conclude by leaving a few thoughts with you. I think we live in an interdependent world. We are all in the same boat. If you wish, maybe boat is too small a concept to capture what I'm going to say. Let's say we are all on a cruise boat. David may be in the best suite in the boat. I may be in a hole somewhere. But if there's a problem at one end of the boat and it's taking in water, we are all at risk, regardless of where you are on the boat. And we all need to work together to save the boat. And with that in mind, we need to understand that the threats that we face in the world concerns us all. We should all be prepared to intervene, do what is necessary at our level. As the Secretary General, I set up a high-level panel titled to look into the question of threats, challenges, and change in the 21st century. They came up with 6 clusters of threats that should be of concern to all of us. The first was economic and social threats, including poverty, infectious diseases, and environmental degradation. The second was interstate conflict, and of course, internal conflict, the civil wars that I've referred to, including genocide and other large-scale atrocities. Then comes nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, terrorism, and transnational organized crime. These are issues that I describe as issues without passports. They concern all of us and all countries. And this is why we need an organization like the UN to bring nations together to try and resolve this issue. The other point I want to make is that the international community has a crucial role to play in building healthy, balanced societies based on rule of law and respect for human rights. Healthy societies, in my judgment, are built on 3 pillars: peace and security, sustainable development, human rights, and the rule of law. You cannot have long-term development without stability and security. And you cannot have long-term stability without development. But both have to be rooted in rule of law and respect for human rights. Let me expand a bit. If 2 years ago I had asked all of you in this room, what do you think of Tunisia? Most of you would have said, great country, great tourist destination, is stable, and development is going on, they are growing. So you would have covered the 2 pillars, development and stability and security. It doesn't matter, it may be a police state, but it's secure, and we can go on holidays and lie on the beach. But the 3rd pillar, which is key, the respect for rule of law and human rights, we hardly ever touch on. And if Tunisia went the way it did, it is because that 3rd pillar was ignored. And if you ignore the 3rd pillar, it's a bit like building on sand. And when you look at the history and development of the countries in Northern Africa and Middle East that are going through this, the revolution, as it were, or Arab awakening, is because the 3rd pillar is weak. And so when we come to assess countries, whether on our own, for corporate investments and others, let's pay a bit more attention to that 3rd pillar. And as I have said earlier, my other point is that no government should be allowed to use sovereignty as a shield to commit gross violations and abuse of its own population. And sovereignty does have responsibility. Sovereignty has obligations towards the population. The governments cannot just accept the rights and ignore the obligations. And I believe whatever we do, we should try and put the individual at the center, the needs of the individual, the welfare of the individual at the center of everything that we do. There's a tendency for people to talk of the state as if it embraces and covers everything. State is made up of people, groups. It is the interest of these groups and people that the leaders should focus on, not use the power for their own personal aggrandizements. And finally, let me share with you, as in my other hat as envoy for Syria, one of the message I had been given to leaders in the region is that there's a strong transformational wind blowing through the region that cannot be resisted for long, and that they should embrace change and accept reform. And I reminded them of an African proverb, actually it's a Swahili proverb, which says, you cannot bend the wind, and so bend the sail. I urge them to embrace reform and help their people live a better life. So I'll pause here and we would open it up and have a conversation.
Right, you want to come down to the...
Thank you.
Come down to the...
Thank you.
To grab my questions. So I think you probably heard the cheer that when everyone heard about your wonderful gift that they're all getting a copy of Interventions. You heard the roar go around the room.
Thank you for... I hope you will read them. Thanks.
So the first question, we have about 1,300 people in the room from 183 different countries.
That's fantastic.
What do you think are the advantages of having so many countries present in one room or one organization, and what are the challenges of that?
I think, first of all, it's wonderful that you're all together from these different countries. And I think in the last 3 days, you have been able to assess for yourself the possibility of cooperating across borders, that you can work with people from different cultures, with different languages, on a common objective. But it also has complications. It's not always easy. But what is important is that we accept that in today's world, we have no choice. We have to learn to live together. We have to learn to work together. And you, as leaders of the 21st century, are beginning at the right time. In a way, it's very interesting for me. I started the way you brought the young ones here to start. I had gone to a conference like this, something similar, in West Africa, in Sierra Leone. I was the vice president of the Ghana Students Association. And unbeknown to me, there was a scout looking around for students from newly independent countries to go and study in the States and then help their countries. And I was scouted, and I went to school at McAllister College in Minnesota. And that's how I began, very much like you. And so probably we have a future Secretary General sitting in this room, and I'm sure she will... And I'm sure she will remember this event when she becomes Secretary General.
How do you see the role and importance of the UN in future years, and how should or could it renew itself?
That's a very good question. I think the UN needs to reform itself. It's an organization that was created after the Second World War in 1945. We live in a world which has changed considerably, and the UN has to adapt. Today, people believe the power base of the UN is too narrow based on the 5 permanent members. And as Secretary General, I pushed very hard to get it reformed so that we can create additional permanent seats and bring in, for example, Latin America, the whole Latin... You can applaud. Latin America doesn't have a single permanent seat. Africa, with 54 countries doesn't have a single permanent seat. A country like India, with a fifth of the world's population. You know. And so, and on top of that, today we are seeing emerging powerful countries, from Brazil to Indonesia to South Africa, and they are going to demand a place. They're going to demand a place at the table. And I think if we can reform the UN and broaden that base, we will make it more democratic and more representative, and it will gain in greater legitimacy.
I think you know that you've had a pretty enormous influence on me, and you're one of my personal heroes.
Yeah.
Who are your heroes and why?
That's, I think Mandela comes to mind because of his personality and what he did. Somebody who spent 27 years in jail and came out without bitterness. His humanity hadn't diminished. He was capable of making peace and reaching out, and made a difference. But of course, he was also lucky to have another partner, de Klerk. I think those two men made a difference. Without de Klerk and Mandela, I don't think the transformation we saw in South Africa would have been as smooth and as peaceful as it did. The other leader I would like to mention, maybe most of you wouldn't remember him, was Helmut Kohl of Germany. And the role Kohl played in bringing the two Germans together, taking political risks, giving up the Deutschmark, which for Germans was quite something, but he played an important and a key role in bringing these the two sides of Germany together. And of course, it also helped strengthen the peaceful development of Europe. I mean, when you consider that Europe went through two brutal wars the last century, and today when you look, of course there are problems with the Eurozone, but today war in Europe for me is unthinkable. Yeah. And it's due to leaders like him and others. Yeah. Good.
Now, in your memoir, you say that the Millennium Development Goals and R2P are attempts to renew the structures of global governance. How do you see the future of global governance? Do you think new institutions will be created for this redefined world?
Yeah, I think first of all, the Millennium Development Goals provided the first global framework for development and to lift people out of poverty. So it was that important. Everybody signed on, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, and the average man and woman in the street, whether in Johannesburg or Delhi or Bogota, understood it. And they also put pressure on their governments to deliver. And since the goals were established, millions have been lifted out of poverty, particularly in places like Brazil, India, China, and others. Not all countries will meet the goals, but at least they have an objective that we are working towards, and in effect, going back to the issue of putting the individual at the center of what we do. There had been a tendency in the past to focus on military might of countries, military might of government, spending lots of money on military. We are now telling them, focus on the well-being of the people and look after them. The R2P, responsibility to protect, also moves towards the same direction. In effect, telling leaders that you do have responsibilities towards your population. It is your responsibility to protect them. And if you do not, others outside your country would intervene. And this is a completely new concept in a world which is built on states, and states believe sovereignty is invaluable and nobody can touch their sovereignty. To manage to get them to accept that if a government misbehaves, people outside can intervene. And as I said, not necessarily with military might. And these are new concepts which 10 years ago, 15 years ago would have been unthinkable. And I think this is also due to the fact that today civil societies and people-to-people contacts have become very much part of international diplomacy and international relations. Corporate leaders, NGOs, writers all play a role in international diplomacy. What we are seeing here is very much part of that effort.
And I'll do two final questions before we open to the mics, but what do you consider the hardest lesson or lessons of your career to date?
I think the most difficult and the most painful one is when you deal with situations where people are at risk and war is pending and lots of people are likely to get killed. And you do whatever you can, you lobby, you're on the phone, you talk to leaders, you talk to the press to try to do whatever you can, working with others to protect the people, and it doesn't work. Iraq was one such example, and it was almost like a body blow because I was really against that war with every fiber in my body, and it didn't work. Another one. It was really disappointing, and then on top of that, at the end of the war, when we were asked to help the Iraqi people restore their sovereignty and rebuild their institutions, I sent some of the best UN officers and good friends of mine, including Sergio de Mello, Nadia Yunus, and Sergio was such a brilliant diplomat that I saw him as a Secretary General one day. They were all killed in one big blast, and that really shakes you, and nobody would ever know how pained it was, the melancholy, the disappointment, except perhaps my wife who saw it every day. And of course, we now also have the Syrian effort, which I got involved to try to help and solve peacefully. But the protagonists are determined to fight it out. Supporters are determined to give them weapons to kill each other. I'm convinced that there is no military solution and that any militarization makes the problem worse, and that what is required is a political settlement that would ensure change in Syria, with President Assad moving on, with a transition government that has full executive authority, with a structure that ensures the interest of all are protected. And when I say interest of all, there are many groups in Syria. We often hear about the Shia and the Sunni, but besides them, you have the Christians, you have the Druze, you have the Kurds, you have the Turkmen, you have the Assyrians, and you have the Ismailia. They are caught in the middle. These are groups that are not necessarily with the government nor with the opposition and are worried about what happens to them. We need to reassure all these people that there's space for them in future Syria. We need to assure the fighting groups that there is an alternative, that if you stop fighting, there will be a political dispensation that would ensure that your interests are protected. So lay down your guns, and hoping that the Security Council will get united. They are divided at the moment, that the governments in the region working with the Security Council can pressure these warring factions to pull back and make the sort of peace that I'm referring to. Whether they like it or not, whether they fight for 1 year, for 5 years, for 15 years, they will still have to come back to the political settlement. The only difference is that thousands more people would have been killed in the meantime. So that's painful. Yeah.
So I love the title of the last chapter in your book, which was Dreams with Realism. And I think that could almost be a fantastic anthem for this group. But let's go to the floor and get some questions. The only bit that's not realistic is we're not going to get through all of those questions. But the faster you guys ask the questions, the more wisdom we will hear. So quickly say who you are and where you're from, and then we'll ask the question.
Sure, thank you. I'm Philip from Australia, but I'm now studying in the UK. Mr. Secretary General and Honourable Chair, because I'm actually the chairman of a Model United Nations Society at Imperial College London. If ever you come by, please come and give us a talk.
Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Secretary General.
Thank you. My question is, groups such as One Young World and Model UN are one of the ways to bring people, not only to bring their new ideas, but also to understand the sort of structure in which the world now works and how it is actions can come through. My question to you is a really simple one. How do we get more people involved in things like Model UN and One Young World, even the people who don't necessarily have the means to, say, attend a conference?
Yeah, no, I think it's important. First of all, it doesn't have to be a big operation. We can start, as I said, in our own community, in our schools, you know, and I'm sure when David and his team started this some years ago, they wanted to bring young people together to work together. And you are doing it in London. Each school can start it. And I got a letter from a young Chinese student when I spoke in Washington 2 days ago. He reminded me that when we met in Beijing and talking about leadership, I asked each of them to tell me what they do in their summer or in their free time. One said, oh, I help teach illiterate children. Another one said, I volunteer for this and that. Or with 3 of my friends, we do, and each of them, in their own little way, were already showing leadership. Yeah. I said, that's how it begins. You are leaders already. So he wrote me a letter, said that had an impact on me. I'm now studying at Johns Hopkins, and I want to continue volunteering and doing what I do. And so it can start small and in your own community and in your schools.
So Kate and I keep telling you to do things. Now Kofi Annan has told you to do things. You have to. Kate, over to your microphone.
And this is Simon from Germany.
Hi there. Dear Mr. Secretary General, I'm from Germany. I'm also one of the older ones of these youngsters here, so I actually do remember the Berlin Wall still being erect. I do remember the German reunification, and my sister is today married. I'm from the former western part. My sister is today married to a gentleman from the eastern part, so German reunification has really brought something together. I'm married to a girl from Spain, so European integration is also working. So thanks for thank you for bringing that up. My question: you already mentioned the disappointment that you had to deal with Syria, or also before with Iraq. And as future leaders, we will most likely also face certain disappointments and setbacks. So what is your suggestion for us how to deal with that in the future?
Yeah, no, disappointments you will face. You will also have some successes. The main thing is that you should be prepared for disappointment. Not every day is Christmas. You will have some good moments, you will have some successes. Even if it's one person you help, it's important. But you must learn from your failures. You must learn from the disappointments. And in fact, if you handle it well, it makes you stronger and you move on. That is what we call experience. But there are 2 types of experience. Make sure you avoid the first one. Experience can be repetitive. People do the same thing over and over and they say they have experience. It has to be the type of experience where you draw the lessons, where you learn. It strengthens you, it broadens you. You develop self-insight and awareness and instinctively can tell where to turn, what is right, what is wrong, and you build on it. And in that sense, the failures, the disappointments, enriches.
Go to the microphone at the back, please.
Hi, my name is John, and I'm from Pittsburgh. Mr. Secretary General, it's an honor to have you here in my hometown. My question is about Syria. Can Lakhdar Brahimi succeed in bringing the sides together for peace in Syria? And if so, what is different in his approach than your approach?
You mean the new one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I know him well. He is a friend. He's a good negotiator and a good mediator. And with these things, it's not static. You sometimes have a break. Suddenly the people supporting the factions may themselves conclude that if they continue on that path, they are going to lose everything. Because all the countries involved have a common interest. What is required is maturity for them to come together, bridge their differences, and work towards those common interests. Sometimes it could happen. Or you may have incredible development in the battlefield, but that even then in the Syrian case will only be the beginning, because you need to have the sort of political settlement I'm referring to. So he may be lucky and get a break, but he is serious, and I'm happy he took it on. I was happy to take it on, and I think it was also right that I stepped down. And I hope my resignation itself was a contribution to the peace process, telling the people, you're handling it wrong, your divisions are making matters worse and killing Syrians. Divisions are normal in any human endeavor. What is important is to have the leadership to bridge the differences and move forward. And we haven't done that in the Syrian case yet.
Thank you.
Kate.
Eski from Turkey.
Hey everyone, I'm coming from Turkey, southeast of Turkey, a small town where the Syrian bombs landed 2 weeks ago. And I just want to ask you, I'm not defender of Turkish international policy about Syria, neither the Assad regime or the people who are fighting against Assad regime. I just want to ask you why the UN is not taking precautions to stop this fire. Because if this fire goes on, it can affect Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran. Everybody, every single country knows it. And why the UN is not taking faster and quicker precautions to prevent it? Thank you.
It's a good question. And this is one of the reasons why I took on that job in Syria. Because it is obvious to me and to many that if we do not contain the fighting in Syria, the sectarian war will spread, it would inflame the region. I have said time and time again that Syria is not Libya. It will not implode. Syria will explode and explode beyond its borders if we don't handle it well. And already, as you've said, Turkey is involved. Lebanon is engaged. Jordan has hundreds, thousands of refugees. We have Iraq on the other border with the jihadists crossing in and out. And so already the fear you've expressed is beginning to happen. When you talk of the UN, I hope you are talking also of the member states, because it starts with the divisions in the Security Council. I have pushed very hard to try and get the permanent members to work together. Today you have Russia and China on one side, and the other 3 permanent members on the other side, US, France, and UK. As long as they are divided, they are weak. They cannot put sustained and collective pressure on the region and on the parties to stop the killing. And this is where I think we should get them to come together, and something that I've been working on for some time and still making phone calls about, even though I'm still not involved. But the Turkish government has exercised restraint, and I hope it will continue to exercise restraint and not take initiatives or action that will compound the fighting in the region.
So what we'll do very quickly, because we have about 4 minutes left, is just each one of the 3 of you ask your question, and then Mr. Annan can put an answer across the 3 together. So very quickly, who you are and your question.
Mr. Annan, thanks for your generosity for the book. Just for your information, there are 184 countries in this room, not 183. Just because the UN does not recognize it, it doesn't mean that Kurdistan does not exist. So I'm Karokh from Kurdistan.
You've declared independence.
Excuse me? That's it. And there is the flag. So the question is, like you just have written a book about intervention. While intervening in a state, the UN or the international community what's the priority for them? Is it human rights or it's the political
Yeah.
balance of power in that area?
Okay.
Clear. Okay, next question very quickly, the back microphone.
Good day, Secretary General. I'm Nomashubi Jagwaja from South Africa. I'm also an MUN member at the University of Cape Town. The question I'd like to pose to you today is, do you think there's more room to increase the scope of the United Nations in terms of protecting NGOs in military regimes and any other stakeholders that oppose the current government in those countries, rather than waiting for atrocities to happen and then only often coming in with a narrow mandate?
And then finally,
very pleased actually to ask this question, because this is a question after my graduation, my first MUN competition. Right, Mr. Annan, well, you have said your disappointments towards United Nations, but what's the biggest failure of United Nations during your leadership? And hypothetically, if you could use Doctor Who's time machine, what would you do to kind of rewind, and what would you have done, kind of thing? Thank you.
maybe a wrap-up answer to all three.
Yeah. No, I think the question about protecting civil society and NGOs, I think goes back to the basic question of development of rule of law. Because if you do have rule of law, and we encourage these civil societies to be active, and what is also happening, which is of great interest, is they are linking up globally. You have robust international civil society developing, and they often stand by each other and support each other. And I think that is very, very important. On the question of if I had Dr. Who's machine, which I don't have, which I don't have, let me say that there are lots of things the UN can do, and you can be part of that. You, as individuals and as groups, can be part of that. In the sense, let's take an issue like the environment and the climate change. In each of your communities or your universities and others, you can organize yourself to raise the temperature on the environment, to put pressure on the politicians and move it higher up the political agenda and get them to understand that it is your future, it is a world you are going to inherit, and the environment is important to you, and you want your leaders to deal with it. You would even be more effective if not only do you organize to push it up the agenda, but you vote, you register and you vote. And you are not apathetic at the time of elections. Yeah. And I have often said that where leaders fail to lead, the people can make them follow. And with real pressure, they will follow you. We had a very good example in India recently. I don't know, my Indian friends here may disagree. On the question of corruption, the government had been debating it for years and wanted to pass a law. They wouldn't do it. They couldn't do it in Parliament until one man, Anna Hazare, went on a hunger strike, and thousands followed him in the center of Delhi. The Parliament had the courage to pass a law. And another message I will leave you with, which comes from my good friend, Professor Amartya Sen, who as a young person at the age of 9 went through famine. There was nothing to eat. And now he's a Nobel laureate, Nobel economist, Nobel laureate. He said, people in democracy do not starve. And you know why? You can starve them once, you're out of power forever. And then it shows the power. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. That was absolutely fantastic. Let's give a huge round of applause. Thank you so much. That was fabulous.
Are you continuing, or this is?
Yes, if you want to come this way.
Bye-bye. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Kate will escort you off. Thank you, sir.